It's been well over a decade since developer Factor 5 brought the action-adventure game Lair soaring onto our PlayStation 3s back in 2007, and at least on paper it really had a lot going for it. On top of being an early PS3 title with all of the impressive next-gen graphics you would expect at that time, Lair had lots of neat features that many of its contemporaries lacked. The ability to access the PS3's cross-media bar interface in-game, relatively seamless remote play with the PlayStation Portable, as well as the now infamous 6-axis control tilting mechanic, all baked into the game. Not to mention, lots and lots of dragons. Sony didn't stop there though and saw fit to continue dumping resources into the project, which led to many high-profile hires for the game, including John Debney as the composer for the score, who is better known for his fantastic work on the themes of Star Trek Next Gen, Deep Space Nine, Sin City, and plenty more. With all of these elements stacked up together into one game, what could go wrong? As you and I now know all too well, something did go wrong. Many things, actually. Lair released to mixed reviews at best, with the main thing keeping it from total failure being its overall production values and a halfway decent story. The graphics were great for the time, and the soundtrack was full of sweeping melodies, but it still didn't quite cut the mustard for gamers. So what happened? Why did this amalgamation of so much great talent and overwhelming pedigree result in such a mediocre at best game that now sits at the bottom of every video game bargain bin around and can barely even crack the $5 mark on eBay? What the hell happened to Lair? As you might imagine, the build-up for Lair was pretty intense, with the game getting plenty of buzz from mainstream gaming news outlets and lots of clicks and views from PlayStation 3 owners who were desperate for something to quench that next-gen thirst. After all, Factor 5 was developing it, the same developer from R-Type, Turrican, and a handful of other good if not great games from the previous 2 decades. Factor 5 also seemed to really believe in the project given the sheer amount of lore that they created for the world to facilitate the game's existence. The story was to take place in a geologically unstable world populated by a sharply divided society kept at odds with each other over limited resources, plus there's lots and lots of dragons. They obviously weren't creating a world for just one game here. This level of depth was clearly meant to be a franchise. Given that, the level of experience behind the wheel of development, Sony's support, and the cutting-edge PlayStation 3 powering it, everything should have been in place for a hit. Instead of a hit, Lair was more of a thud. It released in North America in August of 2007 and other regions the following November to a fairly mixed reception, with most outlets giving the game mediocre scores and some outliers in both positive and negative directions. Gamers were largely pretty unhappy with it though. Of the common denominators of remarks made by reviewers and gamers were the wonky motion controls, the broken features that were promised to work but did not, and the crowded environments full of objectives and points of interest that required a level of dexterity on the part of the player that, most unfortunately, just wasn't there. While the production values that likely soaked up much of the budget and manpower behind development turned out great, there just wasn't enough execution underneath that glossy high-definition exterior. Most egregious of these errors in judgment was the complete reliance on the PS3's 6-axis control system that forced the user to tilt the controller in one of 6 directions to emulate control over what was happening, and, in theory, deliver a more immersive experience when flying through the sky on the back of a massive dragon. Anybody who has played Lair or Flower or any other game that relies on the 6-axis like that knows that this isn't quite how it turns out. Movements were loose, imprecise, sometimes delayed, and often never added anything fun to any game that implemented it. With it being 2007 and Sony still very much feeling the high from the success of the PS2, they were just determined to shove this mechanic down everyone's throat at the time of Lair's launch, so it was a sword that Lair, more than any other game of that generation, would have to die on. On top of that, the game's obsession with fidelity and draw distance led to inconsistent frame rates, which were more forgivable with games like Heavenly Sword, but for a game where you're flying around on a dragon in 360 degrees of space, it made some sections downright sickening for many players. Secondarily, one of the game's most touted features, remote play with the PSP, didn't even work at launch day. Since 6-axis was the only way to steer the dragon and the PSP didn't have that particular feature, this rendered the remote play version unusable. Factor 5 did go out of their way to patch in a thumbstick alternative to the 6-axis and a few other bug fixes later on, which was commendable, but that ended up being too little too late. The first impression had already been made, and it was not a great one. Pretty graphics and great music don't make up for bad controls, and bug fixes don't fix shallow gameplay. In the end, Lair was a fantastic idea and obviously had lots of talented people and great ideas poured into it. You could even say that there was more to it than just the beautiful exterior, with its well thought out setting and a fairly entertaining story. The voice acting, the writing, and the pacing of the story were certainly in line with other top tier action adventure games of the era, but as we all know so well these days, gameplay is king. There is little point in creating a fantastic universe with interesting stories if the act of pursuing that story is with flimsy, gimmicky controls that barely work. Surely, mediocre or even less than good controls can be acceptable in certain instances if a story is good enough, but that's a dangerous road to go down. Games with bad controls that totally make up for it with good stories are few and far between, and as Lair teaches us, that particular balance is more trouble to strike than it's worth. Lair was a game with plenty of smoke and perhaps a few smoldering embers, but no fire. Factor 5 would eventually close its doors a couple of years later, with not much to show since the launch of Lair. Surely there were other issues that led to this, but one could surmise that if Lair had been the success that they were hoping for, perhaps their doors would still be open. Perhaps we would have gotten Lair 3 or 4 by now, but alas, Lair joins the countless other games that squandered their potential over bad controls and poor optimization in the ash heap of gaming history, serving as a warning to future developers that while music, graphics, and story are all very nice to have, it can all go down in flames if it's not fun to play. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching us here at GamingBolt. If you enjoy our content, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification icon so you'll know when new videos are up.